Welcome to the first panel of 2021 from the Ethical Journalism Network. My name is Hannah Storm and I'm the director of the EJN. This is a monthly series of panels we've been hosting for the past 6 months or so during the COVID pandemic. We are really thrilled this time to have one of our new trustees, James Ball, joining us as moderator of this panel. And just very briefly to introduce him, James Ball is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist and author who's currently working as the global editor at the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. James, I will hand over to you and I will pick up and rejoin you shortly before the end, just to let you know about the next series of our panels. So thanks, and over to you, James.
Thank you very much, Hannah, and thank you to our audience for joining us tonight and being patient with our sort of technical hiccups as we tried our new setup out. I think we have, thanks to a little patience from everybody, got everyone on, so I'm very glad for that. Just to make sure the panelists are aware, this event is on the record. We have at least one person live tweeting, and we intend to put out a sort of edited extract of it with much less of my wittering as a podcast at some point later. So I will quickly introduce everyone. We've got a big panel for this event, but I am properly thrilled at it. I think it's such a good mix of people who will give really good perspectives on this. And the issue of looking at coronavirus, misinformation and disinformation and conflicting information really couldn't be more current or more pressing. And there's such a wide range of issues that come into this. There is, you know, anti-vaccine misinformation spreading around Facebook. There is active attempts to defraud people and convince them they need to pay for things or to scam them. There are well-intentioned journalists who may, through the wrong emphasis or through bad sourcing, cause quite major damage, maybe even more than disinformation, with what they intend as real news reports. Depending who you believe, you might think we had some of that overnight from the German media. And so we've got this big range of sort of from everything from good intentions to active malice. And so we're going to try and unpick it and look at it. And so our panelists helping us do this are Mariana Spring, who is a specialist reporter covering disinformation in social media for the BBC News and BBC World Service. So we have Kate Wilkinson, who is the Deputy Chief Editor at Africa Check, the continent's leading fact-checking organisation. We have Nina Jankowicz, who is the author of How to Lose the Information War, Russia, Fake News and the Future of Conflict by Bloomsbury, an excellent publisher. And she has been a Fulbright Clinton Public Policy Fellow. She's been published in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and more. So we have Anjana Ahuja, who's a contributing writer on science for the FT and a former feature writer and columnist at the Times. So, and she has been writing some really excellent and in-depth coronavirus analysis pieces, including on the vaccine, as I know because I read one fairly recently. And finally, we have a man with so many titles, I may have to cut some of them out for time, but we have Professor Sir David Spiegelholter, who is the chair of the Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence Communication in the Centre of Mathematical Sciences at the University of Cambridge. They should really tighten that up at some point. So I'm going to try and, what I will encourage, as Hannah did, is there is an open chat channel. Please do drop questions in there and we'll try and do some in amongst. But otherwise, I'm going to try and talk to each panelist in turn about their specialist sort of areas and then move to some sort of more general discussion. So Mariana, I'm going to start with you if that's okay, and just say, how much coronavirus misinformation do you see out there? Do you have to go hunting for it?
No, is the short answer to that question. We've seen a wave of misinformation about coronavirus on social media that's evolved and changed throughout the course of the past year. At the beginning, it was lots of panicked viral WhatsApp messages, voice notes, lots of really understandable concern about what was going on, about lockdowns, about how you could cure or prevent coronavirus. And while it was often spread quite innocently, its impact could often be really quite bad, giving people bad health advice at a time when they most need good advice, and resulting in direct harm. And as the pandemic went on, we went, from March to April to May to June, you started to see the human cost of that misinformation, people whose lives were impacted and affected by falsehoods about coronavirus. There was one man I interviewed, a guy called Brian, based in Florida, who thought coronavirus wasn't real, thought that it was caused by 5G, and then he sort of came around to thinking it was like the flu, because of stuff he saw on Facebook. He and his wife didn't follow health guidance. They both fell ill with coronavirus. They didn't seek help immediately because, again, they didn't think it was very serious or a problem. And really, really sadly, after both spending some time in intensive care, Erin, who's Brian's wife, passed away due to complications linked to COVID. So we saw that kind of initial real harm done by coronavirus misinformation. But since then, it's very much evolved into conspiracy theories, particularly those. It began with 5G, this false idea that 5G is linked to coronavirus. And then slowly it became about the pandemic not being real. Slowly is actually the wrong word. Very quickly, it became about the pandemic not being real. More recently, we've seen that evolution towards vaccine conspiracy theories, this idea that vaccines will be used as part of a genocidal plot to harm, to inflict suffering on you for a particular reason that's often not very well explained. And those are often spread by particular bad actors who are looking to cause trouble, cause difficulty, to build online followings, to increase their influence. But they are still often spread by, and the people impacted by them are essentially themselves victims of that disinformation, even if they go on to share it because they want to help others or for different reasons. So there has been a total explosion of misinformation about coronavirus, and also about the US election, which has run in tangent with that. And that, again, has often taken the form of conspiracy theories, QAnon, the baseless conspiracy theory that Donald Trump is waging a secret war against satanic pedophiles, but at its base essentially holds this idea that everything is rigged against Trump, that there is a deep state that is looking to get him at every turn. And that obviously has become very much the basis for Stop the Steal and other movements we've seen spring up online based around this idea that the election was rigged, for which there's absolutely no evidence, and going on to inspire the riots that happened at Capitol Hill. So there has been a range of misinformation on social media that has very much spiraled into conspiracy theories, and that has absolutely caused real world harm over the course of the past nearly 12 months now.
And so, as a journalist who specifically kind of reports on the misinformation, the people affected by it, has there been anything over the sort of coronavirus pandemic that's made you sort of rethink your approach or change your approach?
I think that there's often an emphasis on fact checking when we talk about covering disinformation online. And I think fact checking is very, very important. I work with some brilliant colleagues at the BBC, and lots of the other panelists on this call do that very, very well. But I think fact checking alone is not enough. And it is about trying to weaponize the very things that make viral disinformation so effective in our reporting. And part of that is humanizing the impact that conspiracy theories or online disinformation have. Who spreads them? Why do they do it? Understand the ecosystem in which it thrives, and understanding the people who are affected, whether it's relationships that are torn apart by conspiracy theories, whether it's people whose lives are lost, or who become very unwell because of conspiracy beliefs that have inspired them to not follow health guidance or otherwise, and those who no longer, for instance, trust in democracy or are inspired to commit acts of violence because they have been so radicalized by falsehoods or conspiracies they're seeing online. So I think in my reporting, I always try to humanize the impacts that it has, and help people understand that it's not just some fringe internet phenomenon, but that it really has real world consequences for all sorts of different people. And I think by putting a human face on the impact that it has, it engages audiences much better. People are more interested in what you're talking about, because bad information often travels much better than good information because it's just more exciting, it's more interesting, you want to read it. I think the problem is that often fact checks, because they are accurate, because they are good, because experts who are good at their jobs are more reasoned, and they say, you know, there's always risk attached, that means that it can't always fight that disinformation online. And I think by doing exciting, compelling reporting that engages people on the topic, we can at least get somewhere in combating the bad effects that it has.
So that's an interesting view. I'm going to turn and introduce you now, Kate, if that's okay. And I mean, firstly, I wonder, you know, do you feel like there needs to be a broader mix of which fact check is part, or, you know, how do you think it works in that broader sense of trying to tell human stories and get these viral narratives versus having to be, you know, stick to the facts as fact checkers clearly have to?
Yeah, it's definitely not an either or. And I think the point Mariana made is that it really is it's a team effort. It's a team sport at the moment. And we have different groups and organizations working in the areas of speciality. We have fact checkers, we have reporters, we have scientists, and we tend to sort of focus on the work we're good at and the work that we've always done. And it can be hard when you're in the middle of what has probably been the craziest year of our lives. To suddenly think how you can reinvent what you do or do it better. But I think it's a challenge that we have to meet. We have, in some of the work that we've done, probably not enough when it comes to COVID, we have tried to look at the human cost, but time and time again, we do have to come back to debunking, investigating, trying to verify, usually pretty simple and sometimes quite silly, commonly held beliefs. And I use the word silly not to undermine or to make people who believe those ideas come across as ignorant or uneducated. But they're often very simple ideas that are misunderstood, which require you to take a concept, to unpack it, to understand why people believe it, so that you can then go to experts, you can speak to people and try and get a very basic explanation that you can take to the public. And this is actually one of the challenges that we've faced because...
Sorry, can
Jane?
you give us an example of those misunderstandings or one of those? Oh, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah. So something that we're actually doing at the moment is, I'm sure everyone who's watching or anyone who's been a fact checker knows that there's always something to check. And we really try to be guided by what people are misunderstanding at the moment. And often that means taking a step back and not bringing your understanding or your perceptions of the world to interrogating those beliefs. And one thing that we're trying to work at the moment is there's quite a commonly held belief in South Africa that there's an area in the country where the water has been contaminated, and that either the belief is that the increase in cases are linked to the virus being in the water, or the other belief is that the vaccine is actually being trialed on the residents of this area and that it's being distributed in the water. What can be difficult though is when you go to an expert, a scientist, a doctor who is understandably under quite a lot of pressure and stress at the moment, and you take what they consider to be quite ridiculous concepts or ideas and you want half an hour of their time to actually unpack it so you can explain accurately why that can't be the case. You sometimes get a mismatch between what the public is really fervently believing and what the experts or the scientists believe is worth their time or worth debunking. So you sometimes have to act as a bit of a bridge between what's happening on the ground and what the scientific community thinks is worthy of their time and attention. And mediating between those two groups is quite an important work of fact checking, because you're really trying to take expert opinion, take really sometimes complicated ideas and match them with the communities in a language and in a format that they can understand.
That's a really interesting sort of role that I hadn't thought of, kind of the disconnect between what the audience needs and sometimes what the experts feel like they might be wanting to communicate. And it's really interesting to hear how you navigate that. I'm quite interested though in terms of, you know, the practicalities. When you're looking at claims sort of week in, week out, do you sort of, what are the most sort of common themes that you're seeing and things that you need to check? And do you know, how do you triage it on the day? You know, how do you look and go, which of these is the most pressing? Is it a matter of which ones you see being shared most, or a less common one that might be more damaging? How do you make those decisions?
So it is in in a lot of ways, it is a judgment call. We are receiving tip-offs and contacts and emails and messages from our readers and our communities in a number of ways: Facebook, Twitter, WhatsApp, email. People would call our office when we're at the office. And you're trying to take all this information, you're trying to understand its reach, you're trying to identify the claims, the false information that is traveling the furthest. And then importantly, you're also trying to identify the claims that have the most risk for causing harm. So we try to prioritize claims which could have an immediate health impact. But increasingly, we're also seeing a number of other types of harm. You mentioned earlier scams and economic harm, and we've seen an enormous increase in all of the African countries where we work, where people are making money and profiting off people's fear around the virus by trying to sell cures or ways to prevent the virus that don't work. Or increasingly, what we see is fake offers of grants or financial support to communities. And people, if they're not losing their finances or their hard-earned money, they're losing identifying information. They're giving away their ID numbers, their phone numbers, their addresses, which in some way then can be used to profit. So it's a judgment call. We're trying to find ways to do it better. Increasingly, we're working with a number of fact-checking organizations around the world to use AI to help us identify the most prolific and dangerous claims on a given day so that we can make a better decision. But you know, days move quickly and you make the best call that you can when you have to make it.
Thanks very much. I'm sure we'll hear a lot more from you quite soon. But Nina, I'd like to sort of introduce you as a sort of misinformation and disinformation researcher. And, you know, I think this time a year ago, we thought if we were talking about disinformation, we would be talking about the US 2020 election and maybe a bit of Russian activity in Eastern Europe. How much has Corona come onto your radar sort of with your work hat on?
Well, I think it's really changed the disinformation landscape over the past year, frankly. I was first concerned about the impact that coronavirus would have on our information ecosystem. Actually, when looking at some events in Ukraine in late February of 2020, they had evacuated some Ukrainians from Wuhan, and a fake email was released as the evacuees were coming home that claimed that they were infected and there were already cases of coronavirus in Ukraine, and this they were going to a sanatorium to live out their quarantine for 14 days. And the email essentially caused a huge riot in which people were blocking off the streets with barricades. They were clashing with police. They threw stones at the bus of evacuees that was coming in. And it really drilled home for me the idea that disinformation is not just silly memes on the internet. It's not just fringe groups talking about fringy things, as Mariana has outlined for us, but it has offline harm. It will cause offline harm. And I think over the last year, we have seen case after case after case of that harm being borne out in real life. At the beginning of the pandemic, I was asked a lot, as somebody who focuses on Russia and Eastern Europe, you know, is Russia using this and is China using this? I got increasingly frustrated with that question because of course they are. Like, that's the way that disinformation works. It runs on emotion, and especially when we're talking about our foreign adversaries, if there is an issue in which they can criticize the United States or the UK government or any other Western government for their response to something that they ought to be performing better at, yes, of course they're going to use that in their disinformation. And so I think we've seen a bit of a different approach from Russia and China in particular. Russia, of course, is trying to sow more division in the US and the UK through criticizing responses. They're using whataboutism in order to boost their own domestic response. But with China, what we've seen is a bit more of kind of your run-of-the-mill propaganda, if you can call it that, stuff that's been a lot more positive about Chinese policy and CCP response to the pandemic than it is necessarily about degrading the West. Then we have the whole domestic disinformation front, which provides plenty of fodder for our foreign adversaries, but is its own real undertaking to try to push back against. One of the disinformers that I've been tracking for years, who ran an astroturfing campaign when he was running against Senator Elizabeth Warren during the primaries in 2018, was one of the main spreaders, still is, I suppose. He hasn't gone anywhere. anywhere of coronavirus disinformation, and was one of the guys who claimed that you could point a blow dryer down your throat to kill the virus. And I think this just speaks to the broader problem of the fact that it's not that these vectors of disinformation are coming out of nowhere. This infrastructure existed before this problem came to pass. And just now, as we have this exigent threat in our society, are we finally starting to take note and say, the stuff that's happening on the internet is actually quite serious, and maybe we should get a handle on it rather than politicizing it. So it's been an incredibly frustrating year, and I think a lot of my emotion is coming out. Thank you for this group therapy session. But I mean, I do hope that as we talk more seriously about regulation here in the United States on social media, that this will be a key case study in how we discuss social media regulation. I know the UK is a bit farther ahead than we are in that realm, and certainly we've been looking to you in your approach, and you're holding the tech companies to account for the harms that they've at least been complicit in allowing to occur.
So I think one thing I'd like to ask you to sort of expand on a little bit is what I think especially Russia is trying to achieve when it pushes misinformation, because I know from a UK context, a lot of people think Russia pushes Brexit misinformation because they wanted the UK to leave the EU and they cared about the policy. I've seen people in recent weeks suggest Russia is pushing vaccine misinformation in Ukraine so that people are weak and infected and they can invade. And I think people sometimes don't quite understand that they'll often push on both sides of an issue, and it's a little bit different from how they think. And I think it's useful for people to get their head around. So can you try and sort of say what they're doing when they do this?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the big misconceptions about how Russia operates. It's not necessarily to achieve a certain political end, but the goals are threefold. One, increasing domestic discord in countries like the UK and the US, which have traditionally held Russia to account, means that we are consumed with our own problems. And Russia can go and wreak havoc in Ukraine or the Central African Republic, Venezuela, Syria. We're going to be paying less attention to Putin's adventure in general. That's the first thing. The second thing is by increasing this discord in our societies, and again, they're not creating it, they're latching onto things that already exist. Putin is able to turn to protesters who were just out in many cities across Russia this past weekend and are going to be coming out again. He can say, oh, you want a more democratic government? Look at how these democracies are handling the pandemic. Meanwhile, we have our Sputnik vaccine and it is 100% effective. And here are all the ways that the order that I have engendered in our society benefit you. Yes, you might not be able to speak freely, but you can count on your government to provide pandemic response. Look, we sent ventilators to the United States, which later caught on fire, but that of course doesn't make it onto Russian media. So that's number two. And the third thing is there's an asymmetric response here, right? By latching onto these fissures in our society, Putin is able to get himself a seat at the global negotiating table by being the little fly buzzing in our ear for the past 5 or 6 years now. With these disinformation campaigns, he has forced meetings between the US president and himself. He has almost gotten himself invited back to the G7, despite ongoing disinformation and despite the fact that he has not given back his illegal annexation of Crimea, which he took from Ukraine in 2014. There's a seat that has opened up for him in global negotiations because of the imbalanced kind of atmosphere that he and his apparatus are able to achieve through disinformation. And that's why we call it asymmetric warfare, because, open societies like the United States and the UK can't push back with the sort of covert information operations that the Kremlin is running. And we have no choice but to sit down and say, you stop doing that. Whereas, before we perhaps would have cut off relations entirely. Now that's not going to happen. And I think he's been particularly good at achieving that third goal. And again, it's not about achieving one political outcome. It's about increasing Russia's status and his grip on power at home.
Great, thank you. I'm sure we will come back to this one. I'm going to continue moving through the panelists so we've heard from everybody. I will just flag, we've had 1 or 2 questions coming through. I think we've got a fancy Q&A interface. We've got a chat. Please do feel free to drop them in. I will start asking them fairly soon. I promise I will drop them in amongst my own. But I want to move to Anjana now, because I think sometimes when we talk about trying to tackle misunderstandings or misinformation, we act as if there's this amazing sphere of proper journalism or proper communication, and misinformation or wrong information, which is totally separate. And, you know, I think people doing what you're doing, Anja, are in this really difficult position, because what is good information on, say, the dosing schedule of the vaccines? The experts seem furiously divided. You know, the picture seems confusing. How do you try and cut through all of that to a general audience?
The first thing to say is that I tend to deal in misinformation rather than disinformation, because I don't want to duplicate the excellent work of fact checkers. That's not really my role. So my role as an opinion writer is to, ideally, what you want to do, especially when you're not writing news, but you're thinking a lot, you're trying to help people think their way through the pandemic. And I think the challenge for us as writers and analysts, I suppose, is that we are also trying to think our way through the pandemic. Well, the first thing to say is one of the things that I look for is, before I cover something, is it something that is kind of around in the narrative, in the discourse, that is causing concern or there's confusion about? Can I bring clarity? Because that's quite important. And it might be the case that you realise you can't bring clarity, but you can indicate to readers who might be thinking about that topic why there is a lack of clarity, and that's really important. So some of the, so I'm looking back to some of the columns that I wrote quite early on in the pandemic, were things like masks, where you're trying to explain to people, when people are saying, well, masks don't work, masks do work, you're trying to explain why it's difficult because of the lack of randomised controlled trials, because the WHO has a very high bar for admitting evidence on transmission routes. But that doesn't mean that actually for the past 10 years since SARS, or 20 years since SARS, the East Asian countries that wear masks in flu season are getting it wrong. So it's about making a nuanced judgment about where the balance of evidence lies. I do think deciding what to platform is important for me. So, for example, you have to accept that if you're going to put something in something like the Financial Times, a global newspaper, which is seen as a serious outlet, you are legitimizing it. So there's no point me putting up something quite frivolous just to knock it down, because that actually just circulates the idea further. And in fact, one of the things that's really interesting was the 8% story that came out yesterday. And one of the things I've become a lot more careful about is not retweeting things, even to say, this is a bit strange, because that's my little bit of, you know, that's the bit of control that I can exercise in not spreading misinformation. And actually, just from a reading of what was said and the numbers and how infection endpoints work, it didn't seem very plausible to me. So, and in fact, I was on in talks with various people on desks about how to cover the story. The other thing I think about is whether there is a bigger purpose to be served by doing the story. Is it in the public interest? That's what I do with about the boosters. That's an interesting one. So I just saw that there was the former commissioner of the FDA, the Food and Drugs Administration, Scott Gottlieb, gave an interview where he made a kind of throwaway comment about the fact that he felt very uncomfortable that boosters were going to hang around in freezers for people who'd had first doses. I thought this was a fascinating idea, because it came from someone who has knowledge of the regulatory process, has knowledge of, you know, how drugs work generally, and actually was making a creative suggestion in the middle of a crisis. And that's why I decided to write that piece. And for me, the obvious question to ask is, what is the possible harm done by delaying boosters? And it's really interesting, because when I spoke to immunologists, they couldn't really give me a good reason why some vaccines have spacing at 7 days, others at 21 days. And actually, if you look at the immunisation schedule for the NHS, the booster spacings are all over the place. And I wrote about this idea that there are no immutable laws of immunology. It seems that, you know, it seemed to be more vaccinology convention. And actually, I got a lot of flack about that column, people saying I shouldn't even float the idea. And in fact, I think there, you know, I hate to be Trumpian about this, but there are really good people on both sides. But for me, that idea met the bar of being interesting, plausible, creative. And actually, one of the things you do want to do is to encourage people to think, you know, have interesting ideas and push the boundaries sometimes, because we're not in normal times. So those also feed into deciding what I cover and what I don't. But I have to say, it's been a year to remember and possibly to forget. I mean, we're still there. 2021, I thought I'd had the most intriguing year of my life, but it's been challenging, amazing, but it's actually made me think really, really hard about what I do and why I do it and the purpose that my work serves.
So I have several follow-ups I'm burning to ask you, but I'm going to wait until I've introduced David, who has waited very patiently. I will also apologise for that phone call during that. I had a follow-up text. It was my mom letting me know that she's had her appointment for her COVID vaccine. So she's on message, and that is also very good news, as she is shielding. David, it's got to have been quite a year for someone with your expertise and your field of sort of interest. If I were to ask you for a media report card first, how do you think we've done?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I'm a statistician, and I was looking forward to a quiet retirement, and that's not how it's been. And yeah, but actually, it's great, and I'm going to say very positive things about the media. You know, I think they've done very well. Britain has got a fantastic specialist science media, I think. They're very good indeed. Some have really stood out in terms of data journalism, and I won't embarrass them by listing their names, but I could quite happily. You know, we know who's been doing a very good job in terms of their data journalism. There's been a problem, particularly in terms of the way in which scientific, new studies have been released, because the normal business of, well, let's wait for peer-reviewed studies, and they've completely gone out the window. Preprints go up. They even get press released, and a practice, you know, to publicize a preprint, I thought was the most outrageous practice, until I started doing it myself, of course, and then it becomes complete, just a change it in what's done, and so that leaves journalists with a real problem about how to judge these things. So again, I'm a huge fan of the Science Media Centre, who I think have done an extraordinary job to try to keep the flood of good and bad science vaguely under control. There's still some poor coverage from what I might consider the mainstream journalists. And, I'm just amazed that after 9 months, I'm still complaining about the reporting of the daily deaths. Today, okay, what do we hear? 1,725 daily deaths announced, the second highest ever there's been. Headlines like that. It's because it's Wednesday. For God's sakes, on Monday, it was 592, a fraction of that, And the truth is, of course, in between, it's between 11 and 1,200 at the moment, deaths per day, which is terrible, but it's not 1,800 and it's not 600 either. So, and the reporting of that, for it still to be an issue, is appalling. And I think this is due to journalists loving the news. 4 o'clock, they're updating their screens just like I am to get this daily number, and that's the news. Yeah, but it's the news, but it's not very good news. It's a deeply unreliable number. And so I find that, still distressing that this is going on for nearly a year. This has been going on, and yet still hasn't been changed very much. I was, I'm more or less complaining about it just this morning. However, on the whole, been great. I've noticed changes, and at the beginning, when I was interviewed, it was all blame and either blame or speculation. That's all they wanted. No, now there's a lot of just wanting, could you explain this? Could you actually try to put these numbers in context? Could you just tell us the story? And it's really gratifying, because That whole trying to set up disputes and what do you think speculation has dropped down very well. And generally, I think I've been treated very well. I've hardly been stitched up at all. I think it's because really it's become a seller's market for scientists who are prepared to talk to the media, because we are so much in demand. You know, my phone is going the whole time. And so we're needed too much for people to be nasty to us. I even get people, you know, journalists sending their quotes, you know, check the quotes that are going to go into the story. Unprecedented. It's amazing. Anyway, so can I get on to misinformation?
Of course, please.
Okay, I'll try to do it as quickly as possible. Fascinating what's being said. I work in this middle area between what you might call reasonable scientific disagreement, as Anjana was describing, which is just fine. At the other end, there's the conspiracy disinformation, and I don't touch that. In the middle, there's what I might call what have turned into the lockdown skeptics, views, in which the problem with them is that they often start with a reasonable concern, about false positives from tests, about people dying with COVID rather than from COVID, etc. It's a reasonable issue, but the evidence comes in to say you're wrong. And then there's no change at all. They keep on pushing this, keep on pushing that. False positive tests, too many 90% false positives. We're in a case-demic. We're already in herd immunity, we heard. There's not going to be a second wave. Most people die with COVID rather than from it. It's just like flu. There's no excess deaths. All proven to be completely wrong. And yet, there they are, still coming up. And, I sometimes argue about them, but on fairly respectable websites by people who would not consider themselves conspiracy theorists. They keep on coming on. The evidence, how many times you say it, just doesn't have any influence, apparently, on these people who've just enjoyed their platform. Now, the one relief is that I have huge respect for mainstream journalists who, on the whole, have not given a lot of coverage to these. Some have, some outlets have, some radio stations have, but on the whole, they have not been given a lot of coverage, which I think is quite right, not without any having to censor them, just because it's not good science. I think people like me and others do their best to try to hammer this, including some people, and I'm going to mention one name, Christopher Snowden, who's a classic, usually libertarian skeptic, a deep critic of PHE for years, but he uses evidence, and he's produced some of the best counter arguments to the smiley face skeptics that there is currently available. I have enormous respect for what he's done. So I think, okay, just finally, which is something we might get it, we talked about how to counter this. My colleagues in Cambridge have been exploring a lot about countering misinformation by preempting it, by the idea of inoculating against misinformation or pre-bunking. And I now try and do that myself. So yesterday I was on the BBC News at 4:45 talking about, the deaths. And I tried it, I'm trying it now by saying, do you know, there's people who are going around saying that most of these people are dying with COVID rather than from it. That is incorrect. 90% of COVID deaths have it as the primary underlying cause on the death certificate. These people are not just dying with it. So I'm now trying this tactic of pre-bunking, to hit in hard first, get in there quick. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that goes. It's interesting to try to put what has been it's been an academic study of this strategy, trying to put it into practice. Okay, so thanks very much. I do quite like. This is a riveting panel. I mean, really, this is just extraordinary. Thank you so much for asking me to be on it. Absolute privilege.
Thank you. So you actually preempted a question, but I'm going to throw it back to you. But I will just note to the panel, please now from here, if you want to chip in after someone or you've got a thought or something, use the raise hand button and I will come to you straight after. I would normally say chip in, but with Zoom lags, it's horrible for anyone listening. So please do from now just use raise hand or cut in if there's for some reason a silence. But David, on this sort of misinformation area and this 90% false positive, I find this quite interesting, as there's a very grey area where there are people who, there is clearly some percentage of bad faith, but there is also some percentage of they do not understand why the numbers have shown them to now be wrong. And the 91% false positive stat, I find particularly interesting because I still see that cited to one Professor Sir David Spiegelholter.
Yeah, I did the calculations. I tweeted it out. Oh, this is how, under certain situations, it's quite possible to get 91% false positives out of positive tests, because mathematically it's correct, and it can happen with a test with apparently very good accuracy. So
and it may have been good then,
explaining this, and I'm still tweeting, you know, taken as the author, saying, I then said, but those assumptions don't hold in this situation at all. But that was slightly lost. So it's my fault. Me and my big mouth. Yeah.
But what I'm interested in is this sort of grey zone of ones where people might just get their head around the idea of the false positive when the incidence is low.
Yeah.
And then, you know, I have engaged in hours of this on social media. I've seen Tom Whipple do the same and others, where you kind of go, no, but the cases were low in summer and they're high now and they're doing the same number of tests. That shows conclusively this is wrong. How do you try and teach people statistics on the go?
Oh, you just explain Bayes' theorem mathematically. Of course you do. No, this, you know, some people call it a paradox. The fact that the chance that your positive test actually is a false positive depends crucially on how much is circulating in the community. This is a very difficult thing to grasp, I think. I mean, this is a standard Mensa problem about working these predictive values of a positive test out. This is really tricky. Now, we got various tricks of how to do it. You know, the usual one that now everyone's learned about, well, what would it mean for 100 people or for 1,000 people, and et cetera, et cetera. And you can avoid terms like sensitivity and specificity and percentages, and even the term false positive rate, which is an awful term because it's so ambiguous. But it is tricky. This is difficult stuff. And it is and I admire the number of journalists who have got their head around sensitivity and specificity. Is deeply impressive, because I've been trying to bang this into the heads of students for 40 years, and it hasn't. And these are stats students. So I think it's been must have been a staggering challenge for journalism. And I do realise then that, you know, to punters out there, this is very difficult, and they fixate on it. What I can't forgive are the people, the influencers, who keep on pushing this stuff, even though they have been debunked and they know it. And I find that really unacceptable. The initial skepticism was just fine. The fact they're not shifting their position, I think, is deeply unacceptable.
Okay, Anjana.
It was really interesting hearing David talk about the false positives. And, you know, what's really interesting now is the fuss over the lateral flow tests, about whether they're, you know, that's really interesting. But I wanted to make a point about that, because those kind of debates are cloaked in the language of science. And I think that was something that what really hit home was when I was on a briefing with researchers from the Vaccine Hesitancy Project at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. And they were talking about vaccine hesitancy, particularly in minority ethnic communities and the Black and Asian communities. And they said that the most convincing disinformation, or actually just to explain what they did, was they got people in and sat them in front of various types of misinformation and disinformation. And the most effective ones were the ones that were couched in the language of science. When you talk about false positives, error bars, uncertainties. And I think that's something we really ought to be aware of, because also they are the kind of misinformation and disinformation that is slightly harder and more effortful to take down. And just a corollary to that is that I've also been despairing at the lockdown skeptics and so on, because and now I've just settled in my mind, the way I think of it is that the bar to participating in a knowledge economy is quite high. The bar to participating in an ignorance economy is very low. And I just think that that explains a lot. If you look at something that someone has said, and you look at other columnists, and I won't name names, but look at what they've done. Have they done any analysis? Could they have written it off the top of their head? And if they have, then why, you know, why are you putting store by it? You know, it's about having some, I suppose, simple quality control.
Cheers. Nina, I see you also have your hand up.
Yeah, I'm going to take things in a little bit of a different direction, and hopefully that's not unwarranted. I think this conversation that David and Anjala have been having, also we're missing a piece of it. It's not just about journalism and influencers, it's about the social media platforms as well. So I've recently joined TikTok, which I resisted for a long time, but I'm finding it's so interesting as a platform because there's actually a lot of really civil discourse on there, people debunking each other, going back and forth. And what scientists and some journalists have been able to do in distilling really complex concepts into a 60-second, easy to understand video, I think is such a public service. But on the flip side of the coin, it speaks to what Anjana was just talking about. Not only is the bar to the ignorance economy low, the gains that social media and a platform like TikTok in particular, which is so algorithmically driven, they're incredibly high. And we know that social media runs on attention, the attention economy, the emotion economy. And so for these highly emotionally charged debates in this highly uncertain time in which people have distrust in traditional mainstream messengers, the gains are just enormous, financial, personal, political. And I think that's why we see people doubling down, even when they've been debunked and you know, hung out to dry. They've lost nothing from that, and they'll gain more from creating another disinformed or misinformed, depending on how charitable we feel on a given day, video. And you know, that's where I think we get into a discussion not only of fact checking and the role of journalism in this information ecosystem, but where regulation and, you know, private companies need to come into play in terms of content moderation.
Great. And I think we've got an audience question which dovetails fairly nicely off that. So I'm going to suggest anyone who would like to take this one does jump in, and again, put your hand up if you've got something to add to it. But it's from Lillian Fawcett, and she asks, how should journalists balance not repeating disinformation so as not to legitimize it, as Anjana mentioned, with acknowledging it so people feel heard? And she then cites such as BME communities who have concerns about the vaccines. And there was a study out, in fact, this morning from Ben Goldacre, suggesting early take-up in vulnerable groups so far of, particularly of Black patients, was half that so far of white, which could be for lots of reasons, of course. I don't want to jump beyond it, but it's clearly a tension, isn't it? And I see Mariana has unmuted.
Yeah, I don't actually have a raise my hand function. I don't really know why, but anyway, my hand is
okay.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And actually, I was thinking off the back of what Anjana said about that, because obviously we grapple constantly with the issue of amplification and when we should report on harmful conspiracies and the way in which we should do that. And I think the way in which we do it is really important. And I think it's possible to highlight a problem without amplifying the initial misinformation that led us there. So I'm currently working on an investigation that looks at the anti-vax movement and the impact that it's having in different UK communities, including the issue of hesitancy in Black and Asian communities. And I think that one of the most responsible ways we can report on it is by speaking to those people who have been affected and by understanding what they've seen and combating those concerns. I interviewed a woman at the end of last week who'd been seeing lots of totally false claims about the vaccine on WhatsApp, suggestions that it contained meat, claims about microchips, and also, I can't remember what the concern was. but that it was going to be used to cause deliberate harm, long-term side effects, sterilization, and that kind of thing. And over the course of the interview, I heard her concerns, and we tried to understand where they'd come from, who was spreading them. But then we also spoke about why they were false, and she'd actually done a Zoom call with her doctor in Gujarati, which she'd found really, really helpful as a way of debunking those myths, because a lot of she felt that there was a void of information. No one was telling her whether what she was seeing was true or false. And I think that's a huge part of the problem. There was another woman I interviewed in her 80s who very similarly was sent a really scary video with, a bit like David and Anjana were talking about, people posing as experts, white coats, stethoscopes, I'm telling you correct information when it wasn't correct, it was false. And it really scared her. And she said the problem is that I didn't feel like anyone had warned me that there was this kind of stuff going around. And similar with the woman who was seeing stuff on WhatsApp, she said, I tried to find out, is this true, is it not? And I felt like I wasn't getting any accessible answers. And so I think that now, if we totally ignore online conspiracies and we don't report on them, we feel the problem as well, because there's a void of information, but we also risk amplifying them. So it's about reporting on the stories of people impacted and understanding what they're seeing and where it's coming from. And I think in doing that, we can actively cover the concerns that people have without fueling the bad actors who are doing this on purpose to dissuade them from having the vaccine, whether it's because they want influence or something else.
Thank you. And Kate?
Yeah, I think that Mariana's spot on there. And something else that we have encountered is, when it comes to fact checking, and I think when it also comes to journalism, I think we sometimes underestimate how much our work is actually expected and then used by these bad actors to bolster their positions. The debunk, the fact check, the front page article about why someone's wrong may, set the record straight in some communities, but we've seen in some of the countries we work in where those actors actually use that of evidence of them being persecuted, of their ideas being shut down, and how that work is actually twisted to not just amplify their message, but to amplify their position in society. So that's also something to take into account, not whether you're just amplifying the message, but whether the work that you're doing is actually going to be used for even more malicious ends. And, we also face the same challenge of whether to, do a fact check, publish a report, go into radio, talk about something, because there is that risk that you're putting out a piece of false information to a wider audience. So we do address issues when they need to be issued, but we're also trying to look at different ways to address these issues. And fact-checking organizations can occupy quite different spaces on a spectrum. Some of them are purely journalistic enterprises. They work in newsrooms, they publish stories, they view themselves as journalists, while other fact-checking organizations sit much further on the advocacy side, which is advocating for good, accurate information, holding public figures accountable for what they say. And I think that you often have to straddle that divide, and sometimes the work that is most successful is not going to be a big splash report that makes the papers, but it might be working with communities, helping someone who is respected in a community, like a social worker or community worker, giving them accurate information, helping them stage a workshop where they can explain complicated ideas to people in a language and in a format that they understand. And it's not very, attractive, very fancy work that people are maybe going to look at you and be very impressed that you're doing it, but it's often more effective. And we're actually looking to pilot a new project where we identify these key players in communities where we know there's false information, give them training, give them resources, give them airtime so that they can actually work in their communities with our support to combat these ideas.
Great. And one question I wanted to ask that ties to the one the questioner did was, how differently do you have to think about and tackle misinformation or disinformation when it comes from the top, when it comes from political leaders? And I could point to Madagascar, or I could point to the USA here. And how much does that change the calculus when you're responding to it and working out what to do with it?
It comes back to the question of what we prioritize. And, sometimes you're weighing up, you know, are you going to spend your time fact checking the president of a country who, you know, is making claims about the supposed powers of steam to destroy COVID in your lungs? Or are you going to fact check a claim which you know is rampant in a community, but you don't have a big name player spreading it around? It's really a decision that you have to make at the time. But I think ultimately, when it comes to a lot of the work that we do view a very important part of our job as holding public figures to account. And we really do try to raise the cost of sharing false information. I mean, just recently, we had the youth wing of our ruling party, the African National Congress, release what apparently were, you know, draft posters suggesting that people should undertake a steaming campaign to defeat the virus. They should be consuming alkaline foods. And for quite a lot of the online space, they were viewed as a bit of a laughing stock. But we still did fact check what they said, because a lot of our work is pulling the weeds. We know that we can't fact check a dangerous claim once and leave it. We have to keep hitting it on the head time and time again until it disappears. And we have had experience in COVID, outside of COVID, you know, we've been working since 2012, where if you keep pulling that weed, eventually it slows down, and in some cases it stops coming back. So in many cases, when it comes to high profile people, it is worth the effort.
Great, thank you. I've got another audience question, quite a punchy on this one, for all panelists, but I will let whoever jump to it first. Do you think some traditional journalism gatekeepers, editors of newspapers who have published anti-scientific rubbish, have blood on their hands on the COVID issue, as they did on HIV/AIDS and MMR? And that's from Philip Abrams. So does anyone want to take that one first? I feel like it might be one for David, given he doesn't work for an outlet. It's fervent shaking of the head.
Oh,
go on then, jump on in.
I will, because having covered MMR and actually coming into journalism on just at the point at which, I can't remember quite when it was, when the Sunday Times was running its bizarre HIV doesn't cause AIDS coverage. I do wonder at the responsibility of the media when it comes to giving out good health messaging. And the difficulty with that is that we are not, you know, we are not here to be a health service. You know, we're here to think critically and to opine and to analyse and to give good information. But I do wonder at the responsibility, you know, that heavy weight of responsibility in a pandemic, whether everyone has discharged it responsibly.
So, David.
Yes, I mean, obviously there have been some really awful examples of things prominent columnists have written in newspapers. I mean, and I don't follow everything everyone does at all, but my impression is that there's not been a sustained misinformation campaign of the sort we saw around MMR and things like that. I don't actually see that happening in any of the mainstream media. There are things that are crept in. There are some columnists, yes, who put the stuff. But in terms of, you know, papers, you know, just deciding this is our policy about you know, a particular topic. Has that happened? Maybe, am I wrong? Have I missed it?
I mean, one thing I wonder if I'd challenge you on that, and Nina, I have spotted your hand in a minute. There was quite a sustained campaign from several UK newspapers, certainly, get back in the office, open up, get back in the office, partly coming from government messages. But, you know, some of these newspapers had very, very clear and desperate commercial considerations to want people to be travelling. Some of them were free sheets. I can tell you, as a print journalist, it has hurt sales of everyone in print. I wondered whether it wasn't going against government advice strictly, but it was pushing against what some experts thought was responsible. And there was that question of ulterior motive floating over it. Might something like that start to
I think it's difficult because, you know, you might call it lockdown skepticism, but, you know, there are reasonable questions to ask about the extent to which, you know, what is an effective policy about what's going on. I think there is reasonable dispute to have. Yeah, the move into, as soon as it gets into lockdown doesn't work, or something like that, I would claim that that is misinformation, and that is, you know, it goes beyond the pale of reasonable, you know, reasonable discussion on that. And as I said, I can't bear to read this stuff, to be honest. I mean, I know some of you have to do it as your job, and I feel sorry for you, but I just, you know, I just can't stand it. I very rarely actually engage with skepticism, except when it pops up.
Can I just quickly come back and just say that it's I think one of the things I think really matters is where that information is in the newspaper. If it's a columnist, it's opinion. You know, people can say the maddest things, and they have, frankly, in the pandemic. I think, and actually going back to your, you know, get back into the office, we heard that from the top. So, and I think that's different, and that is a policy recommendation in a way. And I do make a distinction between policy and science. So I think there is a difference between saying, you know, go back into the office, you know, because the economy perhaps needs to get moving again. But that also brings into kind of relief this misconception that the economy is at war with health, which I think needed debunking earlier than it was. And the other point is that, yeah, it's how you frame it. I think framing is really important. And if we go back to something that someone else said about again, it's about amplifying. Actually, the way you frame what you say can make a difference. But I think that's going back to a previous point. I'll leave that for another point. Thanks.
So thanks. I will pass to Nina and Kate. I'm not sure if your hand is up or if it's still up from before. Just checking on that.
I just wanted to anecdotally pop in. Maybe this has been less of a problem in the UK than it has here in the States, but I remember around this time last year, driving, listening to NPR in my car, and there was a panel on mask efficacy. And at this time in January of 2020, the advice, and I think this was, you know, early enough on where it's excusable, but the fact that it persisted for so long and was kind of amplified by government speakers is the inexcusable part. They were advising, no, don't wear a mask. You're actually likely to infect yourself more because you're going to be fiddling with your mask and you don't need it. And I remember going to the airport the next week to pick up some colleagues who were coming in from a workshop. And I was like, oh, wow, some people are wearing masks, but don't they know that actually they're at more risk because of this, right? And that has not been corrected. And here we are a year later, and it's fueling so much of the anti-mask debate here in the United States. And just yesterday, I think the mayor of Portland, Oregon, pepper sprayed someone who was getting too close to him and didn't wear a mask. I mean, it's insane the levels to which this has gone. And I don't only view that as a failure of journalism and kind of our tendency to make strong pronouncements when we don't actually know the answer yet, which is what I feel like NPR was doing in that instance, but also of government. And clearly both the US and UK governments have been pretty abysmal in terms of their communications in transparency and truthiness, if you will, in this issue. So I would say there have been some failings, but I also think governments bear a large part of that burden in not correcting the record soon enough and not delivering really clear messaging that many of the Asian countries have absolutely outpaced us in doing. If you look at some of the messaging that Taiwan, for instance, has put out on the preventative measures that people need to take, it's just miles above anything we've seen in the UK, the US, or most of Europe, frankly.
So there's something quite interesting in that I may throw out to the wider panel, in that it's not clear to me that experts have had a good crisis. I think sort of in the UK, we saw quite a lot of establishment figures certainly go against masking, but also go against the idea of lockdown, sort of tell you that you couldn't sort of catch it in environments where very quickly the advice became that you could. I don't think, you know, and I think actually a lot of that fueled misinformation around the government wants you to catch it. They want you to have herd immunity. They're pursuing all of these things. Do we think that either journalists need to engage with experts differently in future than perhaps we might once have done, or that experts need to perhaps rethink whether they have enough evidence base early in crises and should talk differently? And I realise that's a slightly malevolent question, but does anyone want to take a first jump at it? Ange, then David?
Just to say that I actually was really interesting what happened with masks and Tony Fauci. So there was I wouldn't say a hidden agenda, but there was a purpose for his original suggestion that the public didn't need to bother with masks, and that was that he feared that masks would become in short supply and there wouldn't be enough for healthcare staff to have. Now, he could have explained all that, perhaps. I suspect that if he had done, there would have been a run on masks. That's the first thing. And B, experts are always encouraged to give simple health messages. So at that point, the top line message was, don't bother with masks. And actually, he was really honest about why he said that and that he changed. And it's something that maybe he would have done differently had he gone back to. And actually, I think experts have had a really tough time and done surprisingly well, given the difficulties in pronouncing definitively on masks, aerosol transmission, things like that. So I think given that we have had the pandemic for a year, I mean, I think an incredible amount of science has been done in that time, but it's also, I think, made us all think very hard about what we present as science, as fact, as established opinion and consensus when we write our pieces.
Yeah, I actually think the experts have not had such a bad pandemic, and I do think, as Anjana was saying, that the relationship between media and experts has matured. I think experts have become, hopefully, better at expressing uncertainty about the inadequacy of explaining that the evidence isn't good enough to be confident either way, and so on. And actually, humility, that's the word, humility. And that's absolutely, confident humility, that's what you need. And I think, which has been a recommendation for a long time in science communication. And I think, the good ones have done that rather than declaring absolutely confidently about something that they're not confident about, because that was disastrous when you have to change your mind. So, and I think that science, journalists started the idea, as Anjana said, with this view that science is an established body of facts and scientists say, and this sort of nonsensical thing. And I think, I hope they won't be writing those articles anymore. I think they'll realize that science is a disputed area, that basically there's a lot of uncertainty. There are groups with different opinions that now have been aired in public, and that that understanding of how science works, I think, has improved among the media. And I think, that is reflected in the coverage now. And the fact that, as one of these experts, I no longer get asked about things expected to know about everything. And I no longer get asked, well, who's right and who's wrong? Is this safe or not? Or any of these stupid questions. I don't get them. And I think things have improved. Maybe I'm always optimistic.
It's always nice to hear a bit of optimism this year, I tell you. I'm going to ask you one more general question, and then I'm actually going to start asking you for your closing comments, which, just to let people know, given, we are the Ethical Journalism Network, we're trying to help give people some tools. We're going to ask the panelists for some sort of constructive tips coming forwards. But I am going to ask a question from Francis Rafferty, which is there any research that panelists recommend on understanding why people cleave to conspiracy theories that fly in the face of evidence? So if anybody can think of any. Mariana?
There's some really good stuff. I mean, it's actually quite hard to think of kind of one specific person. I think that there's a lot of really good reporting, particularly from US outlets. There was a brilliant article in the New York Times that was about someone who was a QAnon believer and very much planning to remain so in the days afterwards. I interviewed various people for an article I did over Christmas, which was how to talk about conspiracy theories with your relatives over Christmas on Zoom or otherwise, which got a very lovely reception from all my favourite fans. But in that, I interviewed a guy called Mick West, who's written a really good book, which is about sort of how to get out of the rabbit hole with reason. That's really interesting. I think it's called something like that. I mean, there's loads of brilliant stuff that fact checkers or psychologists have recommended. There's a really good psychologist called Jovan Byford, who I've interviewed quite a few times, who has some really good tips if you look up some of his writing and work. But I think actually some of the best research that you can do in understanding how to talk to people who believe conspiracy theories is actually and to understand why they've got there is to look at a lot of the reporting that's been done, the interviews that have been conducted. I interviewed a guy called Sebastian, whose mum has become a conspiracy theory influencer throughout the pandemic. And he gave a lot of insight into why she promotes conspiracy theories, in his opinion, and the damage that has done to their relationship and also more broadly. So I think actually experts are really useful and psychologists have really good tips, but by interviewing and speaking to these people and reading those interviews and those reports, that's one of the best ways of us kind of better understanding why people fall into conspiracies, whether it's anxiety, whether it's social inclusion and this kind of cult-like mentality that often follows with them, looking for answers, or whether it's something more sinister than that. But yeah, that would be my sort of tips for where you can look.
Cool. And Nina?
Yeah, just quickly, of course, Mariana is the expert on this with all the great reporting that she has done. I would also point to the work of Danigal Young, who is a communications scholar at the University of Delaware, and she wrote a great piece for Vox sometime last year. It's hard to remember when, time is immaterial now, but she had fallen into some conspiracies herself when her husband was seriously ill, and I thought that personal exploration of what drew her to them was really interesting. And I think in many cases, and we're certainly seeing this right now during the pandemic, is conspiracies are comfort. They explain the unexplainable, and there's so much unexplained about the world that we're living in right now. And I think that's why a lot of people, in addition to the fact that, you know, we are more online than ever, have turned to them. So I would highly recommend her work and also everything that Mariana does.
Thank you. Very nice.
My cat decided to take a star turn there. I'm actually going to throw in a quick extra question from Alex Hardy for Mariana, which is, I think, a good one for a lot of journalists working in this space. How do you cope with the abuse on social media as a result of doing your job?
Nina actually has done a really good report about this, which is out, was it this week? Last week? This week. Which is about gendered disinformation and people being targeted, which I'm sure she can talk about. Yeah, it's something that's, there's a particular type of vitriol and abuse that comes with covering this beat. There are journalists, I mean, particularly a lot of the journalists I work with at the BBC receive all kinds of different abuse, whether it's homophobic, racist, misogynistic. But yeah, the abuse I receive is quite unique in so much as it's almost like when you offend someone with a religious belief, they are often have a very extreme reaction to my reporting, and that includes calling me a satanic paedophile who eats babies and all that kind of jazz. That kind of abuse is almost easier to handle because it is very abstract, and I'm pretty certain I don't eat babies and that I'm not a satanic paedophile. But I do think that it is very relentless, and I actually was have been talking to various people about this over the past few weeks, and someone I spoke to yesterday was talking about how understanding the disinformation ecosystem helps lots of people who receive abuse to understand how it works and how, you know, people relentlessly bombard you with abuse and the issues of amplification, and should you call it out or shouldn't you call it out? Are you feeding the beast or not? But it's particularly difficult when you're reporting on that very ecosystem, because it in itself then leads to further abuse. So I think, I mean, obviously there are practical steps that people can take anyways to kind of limit the amount of abuse that you see. And I have a brilliant team and editor here at the BBC who are very, very good at doing that. But it unfortunately just sort of comes with covering this beat. And some of my best stories I find through people getting in touch with me about how a relative they have has fallen into conspiracy theories, or how, you know, their life has been totally ruined by false claims circulating about when they attended Black Lives Matter protests, or those kinds of reports. They come from people getting in touch with me. And so unfortunately I have to wade through the abuse in order to find and tell those stories. But you know, they're a really important part of my reporting, so it just sort of comes part and parcel. I hope maybe that the issue of online abuse will change and evolve and lessen, but I don't have much hope for that.
That's like a particularly grotesque form of mining for gold, I suppose, sifting for gold. So Nina, given Mariana mentioned the report, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, sure. So this is a report that we released with the Wilson Center together with Moonshot CVE and a researcher at Oxford, who I believe is on the line right now. Hi, Alexa, if you're listening. It looks at how gendered and sexualized abuse is levied at women in particular. And disinformation narratives are levied at them in order to keep us out of public life. And I would just say that yes, reporters on the disinformation beat of all genders receive this sort of thing, but I think the type of and level of vitriol that women, in particular women of color, receive based on our research is much, much higher. How I deal with it is different than how other people deal with it. I think Mariana and I have a similar approach where we try to call it out. I try to call it out without amplifying or giving attention and oxygen to these people. So I'll block out their handles or take away their screen names. A lot of times my followers get upset at that because they want to go abuse them, but I don't want to engender that sort of thing. And everyone deals with it differently, but the main conclusion of the report, other than, you know, that this is extraordinarily widespread and terrifyingly so, is that social media platforms are not doing enough, and neither are most legislatures in terms of combating this truly, you know, endemic misogyny that has been amplified by the internet. And when you're talking about COVID misinformation, I think it's only more vitriolic, unfortunately. So until the tools are given to users to be able to block this sort of thing out, it's basically just coping mechanisms, and we're really trying to impress upon people, in particular employers and organizations, that they need to do more to support their public-facing staff who are putting themselves on the line in order to tell the truth and make sure that public health, public safety, and basically democracy are protected.
So thanks. And if you happen to have a link to the report handy, it'd be great if you could drop it in chat for those who are interested. I'm actually going to shift to my closing question because I want to make sure everyone has a chance to drop in a tip or two. But essentially, I would like to sort of ask for a maximum of 2 tips from each of you, and I'm going to go in the opposite order from which I started, on either tackling coronavirus misinformation or making accurate coronavirus information stick with your audience. And I'll ask David to start on that, if that's okay.
Okay. Can I just say, I mean, I feel guilty being an old white male, because I don't get that much abuse, and you know, not so much that I can't just mute people or block them or just delete emails and things like that. So I really feel for what you have to put up with. I think that's so unacceptable is a typical English understatement, I'm afraid. I don't know. And as you said, I really strongly believe, I'm someone who encourages you know, professional scientists to get up there, put your head above the parapet, get out there into the public domain. But if this means that, you know, younger people, females, are, you know, so subject to this sort of stuff, then I really strongly believe that employers do need to put in place the resources to help people. Okay, my top tips. Encountering, I'm not an expert at this. All I do is repeat this idea of pre-bunking, which I believe in as sort of strategy I'm trying to take, which is to actually get in there first, counter the misinformation before people are hearing it on WhatsApp. I mean, if they just, you start it, you do the inoculation, you give the small amount and the counter measure immediately. Now, how to make a number, or a fact stick, is again something I suppose I try to do. I mean, and it's something to do with the persona that you project, because I think that the messenger is hugely important in this. The narrative and the style and the story. Numbers, facts do not speak for themselves. They have to be embedded in a narrative that engages people. And all I can do is plug for my work, our team's work. We have had a recent nice commentary in Nature on trustworthy communication of evidence and the 5 rule tips for that, for being trustworthy. So the first thing is, don't try to do these tricks to be trusted. On a purely ethical basis, demonstrate trustworthiness. That's the, just do it right for yourself. Then you are trying to do the right thing. So that's, I'll put the link in the chat. And I think that's something I feel very strongly about. In a way, the onus is upon us to demonstrate trustworthiness. Okay, I'll shut up.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. I will add, though, that the bookshelves behind you really do make you look very trustworthy and expert. So, deliberately or not.
It's all rubbish. Shall I get out? They're all old Biggles books. It's all
So, well, you've angled them beautifully. Anjana, if I could throw it to you next.
Okay, my 2 bits, these are principles that I use myself, one is really think carefully about what issues are worth legitimizing by covering, and not to do it unthinkingly, because as we've talked about, outrage is a currency, and the last thing I want to do is boost its value. So I think very carefully about what I decide to platform by giving it coverage, so one of the things, this speaks to an earlier point, is that I think anti-vax sentiment, I'm not interested. Vaccine hesitancy, good research, I'm really interested in that, because that makes a material difference. It is entirely plausible and really useful for people to say to me, but we're always told that vaccines take 10 years to develop, and here we've got one that's been developed in 9 months. I think it's totally legitimate to address the questions from that, and that seems sensible. The other thing is, the other principle I think has been more important but requires a bit more thought is how you frame an issue. So I was thinking about this because earlier today I was talking to climate postdocs who are thinking of stepping into the public arena. And I think one of the things where perhaps we got stuck on with climate coverage is we kept talking about climate change. And the thing you do with that is that you invite pushback about whether it's happening or not. And one thing I decided to do was to reframe it as the climate emergency or the climate crisis in my writing, because it suggests that climate change, there is no question, the extent is how much do we need to worry about it, it's happening. So you reframe it. And that's what also I chose to do with the Great Barrington Declaration. I didn't think that I wanted to provide a platform by giving a whole column to debunking it. And so I was doing a column about something else, and because it was around and people were asking about it, it was getting a lot of attention. I think I gave it 2 or 3 lines in a column, which was to point out that it wasn't a document that was based on science, it was a document that was based on ideology and politics. And by reframing it, you're trying to give some indication of where you think the debate on that lies, and I think that's become a really important tool for me.
Fantastic, thank you. Kate.
Yeah, so my 2 tips and things that we've really been focusing on at Africa Check in the last year, and will be reprioritizing this year, is first of all to meet people where they are in a language that they understand. We work in a number of different countries, but we have plowed a lot of time, resources, financial and otherwise, into creating audio versions of our work distributing them on WhatsApp, because we know that's where people are and where there often isn't this counter, and then making sure that it isn't just available in English. So in South Africa, we distributed in isiZulu, in Kenya in Kiswahili, in Pidgin in Nigeria, and Wolof in Senegal, and we've seen an enormous response. Secondly, and I think this links to Anjana's point, is that we need to approach a lot of these issues and the people who hold them very strongly with empathy. When we deal with issues that we're fact-checking, when it comes to medical issues, when it comes to conspiracy theories, often for a lot of people, there is a legitimate fear, there is a legitimate concern, there's something they don't understand, or there is a grain of truth which they have misconstrued. And by acknowledging that, by reaching across through the screen, putting a hand on someone's shoulder and say, I get it, but this is the bit you're missing, I think can go a long way to helping people cross over to the right side of a factual issue. And we're actually conducting a trial at the moment to test whether introducing empathy into podcasting, which we distribute via voice notes and WhatsApp, has an impact on belief and behavior change. So hopefully by the end of this year, we'll be able to say whether taking those 3 or 4 lines to acknowledge people's fear or legitimate concerns actually helps them accept accurate information, which I think could go a long way to addressing, especially in specific communities, the problems that we're facing.
It's a genuinely fascinating experiment. Please do let us know sort of what happens with it. Nina.
I think that is tremendous, Kate, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that. I think a lot of my own work focuses exactly on those 2 things, meeting people where they're at. That's why I got my TikTok, and it's why I try to make videos on Twitter, because they seem to do better than some of my long threads where I go into detail on things, or the articles that I write. But also speaking to people in a language that they understand is tremendously important, and unfortunately something that sometimes journalists and researchers are not, even as communicators, are not always equipped to do. And empathy, finally, the most important thing that you mentioned. I think the research shows that, when we're getting people out of cults and things like that, we need to approach them with empathy. That's certainly borne out in Mariana's reporting as well. So wholeheartedly echo everything we've heard so far, and thank you to the Ethical Journalism Network and James for having me. I'm really, really happy to be connected with you all.
Thanks, Nina. And finally, Mariana, your tip or tips?
I'm going to sound a bit like a broken record, but mine was going to be that reporting on this with empathy is incredibly important. Understanding the impact that disinformation and conspiracy theories online can have, why people turn to them, the legitimate concerns at the heart of those, which often explain why they've sought out those conspiracies, or rather been preyed upon, been conned in the first place, and separating those people who are victims or casualties of these online falsehoods and conspiracies from those often very small number of committed activists or bad actors who are deliberately looking to exploit that nervousness or that concern. I think that those people should be reported on differently and in different ways. But I think that it's an absolute no to brand everything crazy and nutty and God, that's so bonkers, even though it's very easy to sometimes. I think that's really important. And the other thing is showing your workings. I think particularly when you're investigating how one particular conspiracy theory or disinformation, bit of disinformation spread online, being able to show who spread it and how, and the different vectors. Or for instance, quite recently, I did a report on the Stop the Steal movement that sprung up after the US election, understanding where that came from, how claims of election rigging and voter fraud had been promoted on social media for months and months and months, including by Trump himself. I keep wanting to call him President Trump. He's not President Trump. I'm so used to doing that on air. Technically,
his honorific stays, so it's okay.
Don't
worry about it. Yeah,
I'm so used to being like, I'm President Trump. Anyway, yeah, I think that's really important, and I think that in many ways that allows you to bring the reader or the listener or whoever's watching with you to understand how this disinformation ecosystem works. And I think when people better understand how it works, they can better protect themselves from falling victim to it and being conned effectively by the kinds of people who want to spread these falsehoods for different gains.
Fantastic. Well, I just want to very quickly thank everybody on the panel, who I think have just been absolutely fantastic and such a wide range of expertise. And I've learned a lot, and I'm supposed to be, you know, an expert on this. So thank you so much. I think Hannah will just have a couple of very quick remarks, but as this is the last that you will hear from me, I also want to thank everyone who's come along and listened to this, and I hope it's sort of been as valuable and as educational for you as it has for me. Hannah, hopefully you are around and ready to take over.
Thank you, James, and thank you so much for being such a fantastic host. I'm deeply, deeply grateful to all of our brilliant panelists who have just led us on a journey of wide-ranging conversations and taught me so much. The Ethical Journalism Network is also grateful too. I would just like to flag a couple of things. This will be on YouTube. This is going to be turned into a podcast by our friends at Cardiff University. And if you're interested in attending more webinars such as this, our next webinar will be on February the 15th, where we'll be discussing social media regulation and democracy. My teeth back in. But thanks ever so much for those who have spent so much time kind of listening to this, and for all your fantastic comments and questions as well. I hope to speak to you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.